Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Ethics and Caribbean Philosophy series at the University of Toronto Center for Ethics. This is our second year having an event on this holiday, and we want to wish you a happy Martin Luther King Day and thank you for celebrating with us. I'm Ben Davis, postdoctoral fellow here at the center, and this evening it's my honor to introduce Tavia Nyong'o, Chair and Professor of Theater and Performance Studies, Professor of American Studies, and Professor of African American Studies at Yale University. His current research and teaching interests span Black queer cultural and performance studies, contemporary art and aesthetic theory, speculative genres, afrofuturism, and Black sound studies. Welcome, Tavia.
Hi, Ben. Thank you so much for having me, especially considering I'm neither a Caribbeanist nor a philosopher. So I feel especially privileged to be in this company.
Well, we have a interdisciplinary broad sense of these things at the center. We got in we got in touch about your book chapter, Black Humanitarianism, in the edited volume entitled Retrieving the Human, which is in dialogue with Paul Gilroy's work. And to give the audience some background, when we were corresponding before tonight, we realized we wanted to talk about some of Gilroy's influences before talking about your chapter. And Gilroy situates himself in advancing a planetary humanism in Against Race, for instance, as following Frantz Fanon's call for a new humanism. So let's start there. How do you think about Fanon and his importance to Gilroy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are a number of ways of answering it. I think that Fanon has been important to pretty much everyone in Black studies, it's probably safe to say. And so to some extent, or to that extent, everyone has, I don't want to say everyone has their own Fanon, but there are varieties of critical Fanonism out there. And the turn in Gilroy's work that I was interested in when I wrote that essay that was in a collected volume of essays looking at Gilroy's work was kind of picking up on a moment or a series of interventions, starting with Against Race, which was published also as Between Camps around the turn of the millennium, and subsequent books of Gilroy's, Post-Colonial Melancholia and Darker Than Blue. And I guess you could say that the always present influence of Fanon in Gilroy's work, and more broadly in Black British cultural studies, takes on a particular shape in those in the work of the last 20 years. And you might even say it's a renewal of Fanon and of Fanon's approach to what we now would call a new humanism. And what does this new humanism consist of, if not a revolutionary vision that in which Fanon imagines, in which Fanon calls for an for an engagement with the with a revolutionary praxis, but also with a transformation in subjectivity and consciousness that is guided neither by the humanism of the West, the dominant West, or the framework of the Soviet bloc of that era, right? So a third world internationalism in many respects is what I see as the call for a new humanism. And in that, there is, here I'm probably speculating or bridging from Gilroy's interest to, to my own and to those of others, because I did say that everyone has their own Fanon, but I've always been very interested in Fanon's relationship to psychiatry, and as an maybe as a somewhat unlikely place, because to be drawn to, right? Because we think of a psychiatric power as a component of biopower and as part of the repressive apparatus of the state. If we read our Foucault, right? Certainly distrusting psychiatric power, and Fanon certainly distrusts the psychiatric power that shapes the colonized consciousness, and but at the same time he's determined to employ it and even to kind of innovate what then becomes a kind of a sociotherapy, right? Which I now think we can place alongside the work of radical therapists like Guattari, for instance. So the new humanism there is a determination to kind of work with the elements of whatever tools are at hand, including the tools of psychiatry and medicine, but also psychoanalysis, phenomenology, drama, right? I mean, there's a really broad corpus in Fanon. I know it's much more than that one essay, that one chapter in Black Skin, White Masks that everyone tends to focus on, and partly I see as the intervention of those works in the early 21st century was those were part of Gilroy's ambition was to kind of bring that Fanon into back into view at a moment, and this is the last thing I'll say, is in which another Fanon who is more other uses of Fanon that are more fatalist and see him as the kind of prophet of ontological negation,
right,
and nothingness on the part of the Black subject, has that Fanon has gained a lot of prestige in all kinds of circles, and that's a reading of Fanon against which I think Gilroy is positioning his Fanon.
Okay, yes, we'll loop back to some of this. I also wanted to ask about your chapter. One of the most compelling claims to me that you made was that Gilroy moves beyond traditional approaches to human rights through the US and French revolutions in order to start a kind of human rights archive from Frederick Douglass and abolitionism as a human rights campaign. And so could you elaborate on this right to be human that you are talking about there, and some of the continuities perhaps between abolition then as a human rights movement and abolition as we hear the term now with respect to prison abolition movements, social movements, these kind of ethical, political questions of our time?
Yeah, no, this is, I think, a pretty consistent feature of Gilroy's work. It's certainly in evidence in the Black Atlantic, and many things have changed and evolved about his thought over the decades, but to kind of consistently combine a critique, even a exoriation of sort of like universalist categories, or excluding or failing to account for like the sordid histories of slavery and colonialism, coupled with the determination to sort of refashion those categories rather than simply to abandon them,
Mhm.
is where, the approach to human rights discourse is where, he often lands. I don't say always, but he often. And I have to also clarify that this essay was written, I'm not exactly sure, but I think probably maybe as long as 10 years ago. And like so much has happened. And the reason that's relevant is because it's not a timeless question of human rights, really, but really a conjunctural analysis, right? So
Mhm.
just before I get into answering your question fully, I just want to note a recent book from 2021 by my Yale colleague Samuel Moyn called Humane, who does a really wonderful expert job of looking at 21st century humanitarian interventions through the lens of this like kind of longer history of evoking human rights, but also the humanitarian, right? Starting with the Red Cross in the 19th century as ways of, he puts it, rather than, allowing reformers to shift attention from opposing the crime of war to opposing war crimes, right? And that paradoxically, this effort to make war more humane in the 21st century through this, the suppression, not in fact the abolition, but the suppression of torture, et cetera, has made war more endless in our time, right? And made the US war machine more perpetual. So I just want to kind of call out the importance of this sort of ongoing conjunctural analysis of what human rights discourse means at any given moment in time, right? And in some respects, I think Moyn's more analysis corresponds to some of the critical work from sort of Marxists and decolonial critics that I was citing in my essay, who were similarly suspicious of the, of the discourse of human rights. But I was in some ways taking that as read, right? Okay, so human rights, this is a problem, right? So what is this right to be human? Why would you even identify a tradition that would be worth upholding at all, right? The right to be human is actually a quotation from Malcolm X, and towards the end of his life, where he is resituating, coming out of the Nation of Islam and resituating the Black freedom struggle in the context of internationalism and thinking about human rights and the United Nations and International Declaration. But all of these are rhetorical moves that Malcolm X is making in order to intensify and de-provincialize to some degree, right? What's happening in the politics of his moment. And so by turning to the human rights rhetoric of the of Black abolitionism, Gilroy is doing two things. One, at one plain level, just sort of identifying this like deeper history of abolitionism, which has again come, in a really astonishingly powerful way in our present moment, back to the foreground of our social movements, in a way that, when I was studying abolitionism in 19th century abolitionism in the 1990s, I had no idea. It's like that this would be the future as well as the past, right? But that also, more than just the kind of return of a kind of a rhetoric of radicalism, is the sort of the what Gilroy ends up calling the moral economy, right, of Black abolitionism and the right to be human, and a somewhat surprising defense of even intellectual traditions like Harriet Beecher Stowe and the sort of sentimental strand of 19th century abolitionist feminism, which has gotten, at least in my field, American studies, I think there were, at least it's an entire generation, if not two generations, of scholarship devoted just entirely to trashing this legacy as really kind of complicit with the reproduction of racism, right? And it's gotten to the point where, almost like the pendulum had to swing a little bit to the other end and ask, well, so what was it about abolitionism that was compelling in the first place? Like, why were people motivated to really be the original, let's burn it all down, right? I mean, there was I'm going to forget the decade, but in the 1830s, I want to say, I'm not as good at 19th century scholars I used to be. There was actually a burnt over district in upstate New York where like so many different waves of religious enthusiasm and reformism that were really down to the body, down to the cellular level, right? It's not just uprooting racism and slavery and inequality between the sexes, but also free love, also vegetarianism, also like new forms of Christianity or post-Christianity. Really, this is not, our moment is not the first to discover, polyamory and veganism and radically alternative and anarchist modes of life. Mm-hmm. And this is part of the deeper kind of history of abolitionism, in which figures like Sojourner Truth come out of, right? Frederick Douglass is up there in Rochester, and then later in the century, certainly, many others as well. So the idea of the right to be human is really a right to be. It's not just a right to be a man and a brother, right? In the way that the classical and liberal, the classically liberal conservative icon of British abolitionism, but a right to remake the human, a right to actually define what it means to be human. And this is something that, and to give an overly long answer to your question, I think remains important and worthy of ongoing contestation. My friend and colleague Jay Garcia, who co-edited the volume, and we actually co-taught a course on the Black Atlantic. He's sort of landed really on this idea of dynamic nominalism, which comes out of, I think, the work of Ian Hacking, but something that Gilroy has been interested in as well. And again, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not equipped to give a precise definition of it, but it's this idea that what we call ourselves, right, is both arbitrary, but also meaningful, right? It's both nominalist, but also it's dynamic, because the names that we give ourselves actually become the way we live our lives, the way other people understand us, right? And to some degree, they're kind of transformative. I would tend to think of this through the lens of performativity and the Performative Speech Act, because that's my own background, perhaps an analogy there. And so the last thing I'll say about that is that, like, the right to be human is an example of a kind of dynamic nominalism, right? It's not accepting the human. It's a call not to accept the human on dominative, normative, white normative terms, certainly not the terms of human rights discourse, which assume, this I think has been central to Gilroy's critique, right? That assumes, not just his critique, it goes all the way back to Du Bois when he's critiquing the Universal Declaration, right? That assume that we kind of have already created a humanity, right? Or that we've already achieved humanity and have to, defend it. It's the same critique made of the categories like the Anthropocene, right? That who is this anthropos, right? Who is supposedly coming on the scene, right? Who has sort of created this sort of world historic planetary shift in the ecology, right? It's not every Homo sapien on this planet, right? There's an overrepresentation there, to use Sylvia Wynter's term, right?
Yes.
There's a radical and structural and historical inequality that, if we don't think about in terms of racism and racialization, we will not actually get closer to the right to be human, but we'll get further away.
Yes, let's stay on, you mentioned performativity, performance, this question of being human as praxis in Wynter's term. That was something else we talked about in correspondence, and one of the ways we were thinking of getting at it that I think would be interesting to me and to our audience is this distinction in Gilroy between planetary humanism and what Wynter calls re-enchanting the human. How would you draw that out?
I think there are contiguities, and I think that one of the, that really would be for, either one of these eminences to say, right. But I see some contiguities, and, at least in one public lecture, Gilroy has offered Wynter as someone, the project of re-enchanting the human as aligned or analogous in some ways with this call for a planetary humanism, in contrast to a sort of posthumanism, which he's always been very, very, very skeptical of, which I imagine that we'll get to. For me, there's also something that, another colleague, Lisa Lowe, mentioned to me, which really actually just, I was like, yeah, that's completely fascinating and right, that Sylvia Wynter, who's, I think, as of this conversation, still with us, and is almost an exact contemporary of Fanon. And so really, when we talk about the, Fanon's new humanism, we really should be speaking about Wynter's re-enchantment of the humanism in the same breath, because they're coming out of that same moment, right? And they are Caribbean philosophers, even if I'm not, right? And that, Fanon's life is tragically abbreviated, but in Wynter goes on to develop this sort of massive corpus of research and writing that, we're all frantically catching up with right now. And so I've kind of lost track of your question precisely, except to say that the idea of the overrepresentation of man and in Wynter's adoption and sort of transformation of sociogenesis, right, are crucial components to to a very kind of complicated project that I think would take a whole other conversation, right? To sort of break down the key elements of Wynter's philosophy, but it is, by our own account, a humanism, right? And it's a humanism that is like a Black humanism, right? And what makes it Black is this determination not to read the human from the standpoint of the metropole and European humanism, but from this profane, hybrid, palimpsest of and perpetually contested terrain, right? I mean, the Caribbean as the paradigmatic in some ways of what a re-enchantment of the human could be, right? Which is to say, not that we all must become Caribbean, although perhaps that would, but that there are different sources for for future humanity, and maybe in particular different sources for thinking about the relationship of the human and her environment, and then the narrative of conquest and domination, and science thought of always as control. There's always, I feel like I could go on a whole tangent on Wynter, but there's the idea of a planetary humanism is perhaps interesting to think about in our moment as we are plunged into the middle of a planetary pandemic, and called to think more. It must sound banal at this point, 2 years in, but like called to think about what it means to be a species, right? And this is where unfortunately Agamben has gone, entirely off the rails and is completely wrong, right? Because he's sort of identified the state of exigency and the kind of need for kind of planetary level of sociogenesis in order to adapt and survive with the state of exception declared by the sovereign. And, so unfortunately, Gauben's revealed his own political trajectory to be headed directly towards the most right-wing and reactionary pathway, very unfortunately, right? I think a kind of planetary humanism or humanism made to the measure of the world, or however you want to call it, I think in some ways we have to be dynamic nominalists here, right? Is one that understands that the substrate of the human is not just simply decided upon by politics, but is actively grassroots contested and remade, right, from the bottom up. And that, and I think this is where not only Sylvia Wynter, but I would also name Octavia Butler here as someone who, as a speculative fiction writer, was in her time deeply, deeply interested in researching the relationship between climate change, xenophobia, racism, sexism, right? And the natural sciences, and always wanted her fictions to be as informed as possible by what she understood about the natural world, right? And saw it as part and parcel with the kind of natural science, right? So, I'm not conflating Wynter and Butler when I say that here are two projects that are kind of and they're instances of and examples of sociogenesis, right? And it's a very, very, the picture looks entirely different, I think, than what, our friend Agamben has to offer.
Yeah.
I don't know why I brought him up. Forgot I ever said that, but.
Yeah, well, it's been contested, and yes, I do want to remind our audience to feel free to post questions at any time, and we'll get to them pretty soon here. I have just a few more questions. One of them is if we could talk a little bit more on this humanist, post-humanist debate. We had spoken about Zakiyyah Iman Jackson's Becoming Human as a kind of recent touch point here. And some concepts at play include what Gilroy talks about in terms of infrahumanity, and vis-a-vis what Jackson calls black plasticity. So, how do you think about this? The post, however we want to talk about it, these moves from the planetary humanism to a post-humanism.
Well, so yeah, what do I think, right? I am probably more comfortable with posthumanism than Gilroy is, right? Although he was, my teacher. And, I often wonder why that is. Partly am, I'm not nostalgic for the human, and I also don't think that I've also been incredibly, I'll put it in affirmative case, I've always been incredibly interested in what can happen if we're not, the idea of metamorphosis and transformation and even hybridity, right? Do these have to be like bounded by the human? That said, the critique of post-humanism has often, and I think maybe persuasively, been that it's an attempt to get past a category that many people have not yet arrived at securely, right?
Mm.
To which I think the only response is I often joke with a dear friend, Jana Brown. We tell each other, well, like, who wants to be human anyways, right? But I think that the idea of infrahumanity, as Gilroy explores it, does have to do with an embracing, not simply, and he's critical, he's just observing this phenomenon, but it's sort of like, his example, I believe, was like Snoop Dogg, right? Like places in Black popular culture and hip hop in which the in which all that follows from the statement, I'm not a human being, right? Is actually a space of supposed, supposed liberation from the obligation of, or the burden of human subjectivity, but also is always a kind of dance with a dance of the double, as it were, right? Specifically, this idea of dehumanization, and the problem, which I think only, to my knowledge, Zakiyyah Jackson has been the first to really kind of solve, is or the most persuasive recent version of this is that, yes, to dehumanization and the animalization of Black being is kind of at the core of scientific racism and the justifications of slavery. This is but that places you in a kind of double bind if you accept that, right? That therefore, racism dehumanizes us. Therefore, we must, we must achieve, we must kind of correct that and sort of be brought into the magic circle of the human, right? That is a double bind, right? And what the innovation of becoming human, and one of the many innovations of that text is sort of argue through this idea of Black plasticity, is to sort of re-argue that. And I think it is sort of, it's not directly in dialogue with Gilroy's concept of infrahumanity, but there's an illustrative, resonance, I think there. And to say that, like, what the figure of the Black does ontologically for an anti-Black world is not to be less than human, right? Subhuman, but, and I'm not going to give the exact quote, both sub, supra, and para, right? It's actually just the flexibility of Blackness vis-a-vis the human is what keeps Blackness sort of outside the charmed circle of the human, while also continuously kind of threatening the human with something that that it is not, right? It's sort of like creating a sense of vertigo, right, around a vertiginous fear of again, this sort of plasticity. So this is obviously in conversation with Catherine Malibu's, I think, very influential revival of the sort of Hegelian concept of plasticity, but with a very particular critique of the way in which modern ontology comes to depend upon Blackness as a figure for the plastic, seen here not simply as the subhuman, but as the sub, supra, and there's even a kind of a quantum superposition that she makes that actually paradoxically then becomes a place of I might call it possibility, right? Is that if you're kind of always super in superposition in relation to the human, if your existence can never fully be kind of stably measured, right? In that kind of, in terms of like quantum mechanics, right? Then there are these possibilities for kind of a Black aesthetics or a Black being that is radically opaque, subversive, entangled, right? These then become possibilities that are, I would say, maybe post-human possibilities, right? Or certainly possibilities that are outside of the classical conception of human being. And there's also, I would just add there, in addition, a whole conversation that then opens out around ecology that could be had, right? And this is also another place that I think Gilroy's work has gone in the past 5-10 years, is to really center the ecological crisis as, again, a question for planetary humanity to respond, but one that we cannot respond to without, fully understanding and grappling with the histories of colonialism and slavery and their enduring manifestations in the present that prevent us from actually, I'm saying things that everyone on this call knows, right? But then actually prevent us from actually grappling with taking all the steps that Greta Thunberg wants us to take.
Yes.
It's not obvious. It's quite apparent that to actually take the measures that would be required would entail a wholesale, upheaval of the modern world order that is not in the interests of, those who continue to, to profit from it. Right?
Well, I'm glad you're saying it and with such clarity, because the part of the point of the discussion and having it on YouTube is to have a conversation with larger audiences. So that's important. Before, this will be my last question before we get to audience questions. And again, I would encourage those watching to post a question. Feel free in the chat. But I wanted to add, I like to bring in a little bit of the voice of the person with whom I'm having the conversation. So I wanted to read a little bit on this posthumanism question from your book Afrofabulations, where you argue, quote, "It is the very exception of Blackness and queerness from the humanist standard that produces the possibility of imagining humanity otherwise." And so here we could go in a few different directions. One of them is if you could talk a little bit more about some of your the method that you're doing there, what you see as the implications of that kind of claim for continued scholarship or practice, or however you think about those connections.
Yeah, I think that, well, thank you for reading that. That was probably in the back of my mind when I was, throwing the Agamben under the bus earlier, because, and it's an ongoing process for me, because I think reading that work was quite influential for me for many years. And so State of the Exception,
Yeah.
Anyways, I'm grappling, this may not be of interest to your audience, but like I've been grappling with sort of like what it has meant to sort of see him go so wrong, right?
Yeah.
And actually feel like it's not just some arbitrary, idiosyncrasy, right? But something that actually is sort of deeply in the work there. So there's something about the State of Exception and the formulation of exception. Alexander Weheliye and his habeas fiscus, I think, has done a lot to kind of correct. And then by way of this is like, deeply, this deep reading of Black feminist theories of the human, particularly Sylvia Wynter and Hortense Spillers. So there's that work out there on the table, right? And in Alex's work is important, certainly to me. And there's a whole chapter in the book that I am engaging with the ideas of habeas fiscus. What I'll say is what I was trying to get across, and I think it would be both for theory and for practice, but maybe even more for practice, right? Is whereas I guess it's a version of what I was just saying earlier, that being excluded from the human is presents an opportunity to reimagine the human, right? And so I'm fully in agreement with the Fanonian project of a new humanism, or humanism made to the measure of the world. And but the terms are so loaded. So like this may be a little bit of a, hopefully not too long of a detour, but I've been rereading some of the reception of Foucault in the 70s. And in the 70s is actually, Gilroy touches on this briefly, but sort of for feminism and then also for gay liberation, the term human rights is important, right? In a particular way, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that, it has a particular meaning, right? And one of those meanings is, for the gay liberationists, is the right to, do what we want to do and still be considered human, not to be rounded up by the police, right? Not to lose your job, not to be, assaulted or murdered, right, as is happening disproportionately to trans men of color, then and now. So, the right to be human is not just simply a legalistic right that can be defended in the court of law. In fact, quite often, when it comes to the courts, right, or even like hate crimes legislation, it's very ex post facto. We don't even need to get into it, but it's often quite suspicious, right, because it's part of the, it can become very quickly enlisted to the carceral state, right? This idea of like punishing people, right, is really not where most, enlightened prison abolitionists we want to go in the first place, right? But rather, a human rights which is really built around, is basic as it sounds, the creation of safe spaces, right? And safe spaces, or like viable modes of life. Gilroy calls it convivial culture, right? And what is the capacity, the capacity for different forms of life to live alongside each other without, killing each other, without recourse to violence, right? This is like it's both a project, but also it's a kind of capacity, that is much closer to the surface than we sometimes think. That I'm influenced actually by social theorists who say that actually organizing people to pick up weapons and kill each other takes effort, right? That's not the default mode, right? And so that the idea of Blackness and queerness as spaces where we can find experiment with with different ways of being human, and I don't want to get on a high horse, but maybe say less consumerist ones, maybe more internationalist ones. Like all these, there are a lot of things that we have the capacity to do, even within, even within states of injury, within states of trauma. I think there's a lot of emphasis on those states at the moment, right? That there's so much that we are facing, right? That we kind of lose sight of the capacities of what I in the essay called Black radical becomings, and this idea that Blackness is not a single stable essence, but a utopian striving, right? And that the utopian striving, which everyone likes to shout down, as Jose Munoz once said, right? Why is it easy to shout down utopia? It's easy because we can easily point to utopian plans that seem kind of awful, right? Or totalitarian even. But and I think Gilroy is utopian very much in this respect, looking to philosophers like Bloch, but also looking to the sort of like moral economy of Black music. I think this is like the one place I differ with him, is that I think he really identifies this in the past with certain kind of past moments of Black music, and I still see it today. I still see this utopianism today, and not just in music but in other forms, right? But it's a simple but crucial point to understand that the utopianism that I'm interested in is not a full-blown like ideology, or system, but a wish, a kind of omnipresent wish, immanent within, something as simple as a lyric, like a song like Jerusalem, which then goes global, right? And expresses in a way that is both kind of quintessentially South African and planetarily human, right? A sort of response to the COVID-19 crisis, right? To me, when, back in the Black Atlantic, when Gilroy was talking about the politics of transfiguration and the lower frequencies, right? Those are still there, right? And they're still here in electronic, hybridized, recombinant musics, songs like Jerusalem, sorry, and that aspiration for something more or something other is, I think, really remains crucial to Black music and Black culture.
Well, before we get to our audience's questions, let me just thank you again. I learned a lot from this conversation and appreciate your joining us here.
Thank you.
Okay. Could you talk more about the question of performance and where you see sites of performance of a new humanism?
I think I was just talking about performance when I was talking about Jerusalem. Music and popular musics. I don't think we have to go far, right, to find. The whole point of the utopian wish, as Bloch outlines it in the Principles of Hope, it is profane, right? I think we're mistaken if we become kind of like purists about this and look to it only in highly aestheticized forms that are kind of separated from the kind of capitalist circulation, right? I think it's it's been a while since I went through those examples in Bach, but part of the way in which commodity culture captivates is through the society. The spectacle is through through kind of feeding the utopian wish, right? And that may be a reason to be cynical about it, right? And say, well, then actually our hope for a better world or a different world is precisely what keeps us, kind of captured, to this one. It's like taking the blue pill, right? In kind of strict terms. But I've taken the red pill, and I don't know, that's not a really great world either. I think that there's something about wanting to stay in this world and to as I would say this as leftists and as artists, either category, right? Where leftists are dealing with the people and artists are dealing with audiences of some kind, right? In either case, you have to sort of engage how the utopian wish is formulated, and performance is when they are powerful, I mean, Black performances are, incredibly powerful on this score. I'm just kind of free associating at this point to answer this question. What is the difference between a performance that's just like technically a performance, like someone does something in a room, versus something that kind of connects, right? That sort of is like amplified, not necessarily in all those, ways of being kind of pre-formatted or legible according to, that's I think the big problem today, right? Is that, thanks to digital culture, so much culture, thanks to digitalization, so many things kind of pre-formatted, and no sooner does something kind of like speak, to a moment, then it, becomes instrumentalized, right? So those are big problems in thinking through performance today. But if I haven't lost the question entirely, and if I have, please do repeat it. I remain a performance studies scholar because I do think that the co-presence that that performance demands of us is part of where that conviviality begins, right? It's where like my utopian wish meets your utopian wish, right? And they are not necessarily the same, right? And we have to kind of figure that out. And that gets called improvisation if it's, in a jazz club, and it gets called choreography if it's in dance, and it gets called something else if it's coders in a room, right? It's called something else if it's a community organizer, right? I think that's what's so beautiful about this present moment of abolitionism. And I think that we can find a genealogy for this. This would be an interesting project for someone to do who wants to go back to the 19th century for some reason. But, the discovery that, to make a long story short, the reformers of the 18th century said slavery is a moral evil, but the economy depends upon it and Black people are inferior. So let's get rid of this slowly, like over generations, right? And then abolition said, actually, no, slavery is a moral evil. Black people are equals to whites. Let's abolish this institution now, right? And just ruin the economy and figure it out from there, right? That's the conflict, right? And so I'm being very, very basic there, but then what then happens is that when you arrive at that decision that you're just committed to just reassembling society from the ground up, that becomes an incredibly powerful experimental place, right? And that is very radical and performative. And so what's so interesting about abolitionism today is that it is, like as Ruth Gilmore says, we change everything, right? And that seems really impossible and exhausting. And there are real questions of burnout. And I don't mean to diminish any of this, but the experimentalism of that demand to change everything has sources in the genealogies of abolitionist performance. I would say that's one. And the other thing is it then brings kind of political and economic work and maybe ethical work in terms of your podcast together with aesthetic work, right? Then aesthetics is not so far apart. It's not something, I mean, it could be in a gallery, but it doesn't have to be in a gallery, right? It's the aesthetics of everyday life. And that's where the utopian wish, that's where the rubber hits the road there.
Great. Okay, this will be our last question as we're getting to the promised hour. You had mentioned refashioning categories. Can you talk about how that refashioning happens, or what it looks like, what it means to refashion a category?
Oh, wow. To be confronted with one's own words mere minutes after saying them. Maybe the questioner will give me more details. I was probably talking about dynamic nominalism at that moment. And
yes, in the human, I think.
Yeah, so refashioning. Well, certainly the idea of re-enchanting the human or refashioning the categories of the human, refashioning our categories. what does this entail? Again, it does entail some necessarily. I think it does entail something collaborative, but it also, um, and again, I'm just speaking speculatively, not speculatively, but like, I may reconsider this answer, but I mean, I think that I don't want to overemphasize the collective, right? Because I also want to say that there's something very interior about a reformulation or refashioning. Maybe just to linger with that term fashion and refashioning, right? And stylization. There's a way in which, of course, I mean, one of the most compromised like places of aesthetics we could say is like the global like the fashion industry and fast fashion. It's like what's less promising as a point of departure for thinking about like radical alternatives than that, right? However, if we look again to Black radical becomings, right, going back to Olaudah Equiano, one of the first things that he does upon attaining his manumission from slavery is buy himself a set of superfine clothes. So to refashion himself, right, and the tradition of what is Sojourner Truth was not born Sojourner Truth, right? She gave herself that name, right? The importance of renaming yourself in contemporary trans culture, right? And the politics of and poetics of self-nomination. I think this is part of and reflects at a minimum kind of like an inner work that's obviously always in tandem, right, with communities, right, and with the outer world, but it is an inner work as well, right? And so that's what I think refashioning categories might mean, right? And it is a struggle, right? We're refashioning categories right now, all over the place, right? And there's this fierce blowback against that. Categories of gender and sexuality just to touch upon the most hot button ones. But this is what it means to possess the right to be human, right? There's an ethics in the Foucauldian sense, right, of the care of the self, not in this sort of compromised neoliberal privatized self-care, in which, as my friend Damon Young says, this obligation to take care for others then ultimately gets routed back to the self as like taking care of yourself because like you don't care about others, right? But instead a set of experimental procedures and interrogations of how one might come to live in the world, right? And almost an existential, right, search for a new set of categories by which one could live, right? This is, I always want to have this like, tattooed on my wrist from Fanon, right? Oh, my body, making me always a man who questions, right? I mean, there's a gender thing there. It's problematic, but like this idea of the body questioning the self, right? And that is, I think, what I would say by way of refashioning categories, right? And all those categories, right, including body, man, et cetera, are perpetually being reformulated as they should be if we want to avoid a static avoid a static conception of the human.